This is EWA Radio, the official podcast of the Education Writers Association, and I'm public editor Emily Richmond. There is only one federal jobs program designed to help millions of young people who aren't already working or in school, and it's in shambles. That's the conclusion from a new no-holds-barred investigation by Ann Kim, a contributing editor at Washington Monthly. She's also an EWA Reporting Fellow and joins us now. Ann, welcome back to EWA Radio.
Thank you so much for having me, Emily. It's a real privilege.
So I'm going to try to sum up some key themes from your investigation. We've got a generation of young people who are arguably at a record level of risk of disengagement thanks to the pandemic. There's one large-scale federal program designed to help them, and it's falling short in effectiveness. There's no transparency with these private contractors who have a death grip on billions of federal dollars being spent on the program, and the policymakers who could fix it seem to have no concept of how poorly it's being run. Did I miss anything?
You pretty much summed it up.
Well, thanks for coming on the podcast, Ann. It's been fun. No, we're not going to sum it up that fast, but there's a lot in there. And let's start right at the beginning, though, and explain to people, what is Job Corps?
Sure. This is a War on Poverty era program. It was launched back in 1964 by Sergeant Shriver, the Kennedy scion. He was also the founder of the Peace Corps. And, it started out with the best of intentions. The idea was to have basically kind of work camps for disadvantaged young people to learn a skill, live in an environment that may be different from where they were growing up, get an education, and then come back out into the world and be productive citizens. So it started with the best of intentions. The budget is about $1.7 billion a year, but over the 50 plus years that this program has been in operation, the model hasn't changed at all. We know a lot more now about the kinds of things that might help young people who are out of school and out of work. The challenges that are facing young people who are in these circumstances have become infinitely more complex. But this program is really kind of frozen in time. And what's happened is that it's become less and less suited to the needs of these young adults. And it has become really kind of a boondoggle for these private contractors you mentioned, Emily, who have been hanging on to these contracts for years. In fact, some of these companies have been running Job Corps centers pretty much since the start of the program. And it has become something of a policy backwater. And it's a real shame for the young adults who go to this program, Job Corps, hoping to find a new start, but being really disappointed by what the program has to offer or doesn't offer.
Well, let's break this down a little further. Who are the students who sign up for this program? What criteria do they have to meet to be eligible?
So let me back up a little bit and talk about this really uncovered crisis of disconnection among young adults today. We had, before the pandemic, about 4.5 million young adults between the ages of 16 to 24 who are not in school, not working. The best estimates now are that number has swelled to at least 6 million. The Brookings Institution put out an estimate that said it could be as high as 10 million because young people have really borne the brunt of the job losses in the early part of the pandemic because so many are in healthcare, so many are working in restaurants, that kind of thing. This program was intended to help disconnected young people get reconnected to either education and training opportunities. Job Corps at the moment serves probably 80% of its young adults who are enrolled are between the ages of 16 to 19, and then a smaller cohort are between the ages of 20 and 24. To be eligible for the program, you have to be not only a disconnected young adult, but someone that's facing some sort of barrier to employment. So there is a significant chunk of these young adults who are homeless, who may have aged out of foster care, who may be run away. A significant share don't have high school diplomas. They have a lot of challenges in their lives, and quite a few have probably experienced some sort of trauma that has made it difficult for them to get back on their feet. So starting out, Job Corps is a program that is working with a really difficult, challenged population that needs a lot of help to get back on track.
You mentioned the annual budget of roughly $1.7 billion. And while this is not an apples-to-apples comparison, that's roughly the budget of the Jefferson County Public Schools, which serves metropolitan Louisville, Kentucky. And they have 86,000 students. How many students are being helped by Job Corps?
Well, that number is declining. right before the pandemic, it was below 50,000 at that point. At its height, it was probably serving about closer to 70, 80,000. This was decades ago. There's 123 Job Corps centers around the country. Many of them are in disused military installations or converted campuses of different types. A lot of them are in rural areas and small towns, and that becomes part of the reason why Job Corps is so difficult to reform. We can talk about that later. The enrollment dropped to below 10,000 during 2020. So now we're looking at an extremely expensive program, $1.7 billion, to serve the relatively small number of young adults that are enrolled from year to year.
And of course, the biggest difference between Job Corps and a traditional public school, it's not just that they don't have bricks and mortar classrooms and teachers and staff, but they're paying students living and learning expenses.
Right. That's actually one of the signature features of Job Corps that was a point of pride back when it was founded. There's going to be a residential program. So it'd be a little bit like a college experience in a way. The students live in dorms, they get uniforms, they get clothing allowance, they get medical and dental care. And the idea was to create this wholesome, top down shift in the environment the young people were experiencing that would transform their lives in some way. Unfortunately, that's not what happens at a lot of Job Corps centers. There have been audit after audit after audit by the government showing that the program doesn't work. And unfortunately, these residential centers often have safety and security problems as well as a result of what's going on there.
What you mentioned, of course, is that there have been decades of audits that have found that there are really significant problems here. But what we haven't seen is decades of news coverage really picking this program apart. Why the silence?
Well, a big part of the silence actually is the silence of DOL itself. You mentioned early on in your introduction, Emily, about the lack of transparency. And that is one of the more surprising things that I came across in the course of trying to report this story. I emailed the contractors who run the program, got either radio silence or an email that just said, sorry, we don't give interviews. I must have sent in at least a half a dozen requests, each of different officials within Department of Labor asking for interviews. Nothing. So it is I used the word backwater to describe it before. In a way, I kind of think it is purposely so. There's not a lot of information. The public information that's out there is kind of opaque with a lot of kind of random numbers and these report cards that take a lot of deciphering. They're not transparent, and you do have to wonder why. And then when you kind of look at the Inspector General reports or the GAO reports that have come out over the years in Job Corps, every year, every 2 years, there's something new. And you look at the aggregation of these reports together, you begin to kind of see why the DOL is not out there bragging about the performance of this program. Because it has been subpar for so long, but the agency perhaps doesn't have the resources to deal with it. And there's a lot of inertia that prevents reform of the program for a couple of reasons. For one, there's a Job Corps center in every state. It's a source of employment. I mentioned that a lot of these centers are located in rural areas or in small towns, and members of Congress are happy to have them there. And with any, I guess, special interest, you have a small coterie of very motivated players, in this case, private contractors, who are very interested in keeping the status quo. And they have managed to succeed in basically shutting down efforts to take a hard look at the program.
Well, there's tolerating lackluster results and so-so outcomes for students and mixed bags when it comes to these kinds of reporting. But then there's tolerating what sounds like really dangerous living environments for some of these students. Talk to us a little bit about the crime statistics you found on Job Corps participants.
Safety and security is one of the major concerns at these Job Corps centers, and it is one of the few times that the program comes to the attention of Congress. In 2015 was the last time there's a lot of attention paid because there are two separate murders at two separate Job Corps facilities of students. That led to a spate of other audits. There was a report that looked at just program year 2016-2017 and found there are close to 14,000 safety and security incidents at Job Corps centers across the country, half of them dealing with assaults or drug violations. The rest were sexual assaults, alcohol-related crimes. And you do have to wonder what is going on. at these centers. And these reports simply report what happened. But there hasn't been as much of a deep dive as you would think about why these incidents occur. Why is this happening? And I think one clue is the fact that this is just a training and employment program. And as I mentioned before, a lot of these young people are coming into these facilities with a lot of challenges in their lives. But this program is not providing mental health services, is not providing guidance counseling, is not providing a lot of the kind of wraparound supports that a young person might need to get themselves back on track. That is something that one of the few former staffers at Job Corps who was willing to talk to me said, that there simply aren't enough supports within the constraint of the program to deal with some of the challenges of the young people who are coming in. So you have this outdated program, outdated model that's ill-equipped to deal with a whole host of challenges, and for-profit contractors who are mostly interested in keeping people enrolled and seats occupied, but may have less incentive to ensure that everyone is fulfilling their potential.
We're talking with Ann Kim of Washington Monthly about her reporting on disconnected young adults and what might better help them find educational programs that lead to independent lives and meaningful work. Her story was supported in part by an EWA Reporting Fellowship. Don't miss an episode of EWA Radio. You never have to. You can find us on your favorite podcast app. And thank you to everyone who has rated us on iTunes. Your support and feedback are helping us to grow. And we do want to mention that you found a few examples of success stories of people coming out of Job Corps. Who does the program seem to work best for?
Yes. Given the thousands of people who go through Job Corps every year, you're going to find some great success stories. And I was really fortunate to find some young people who really did well. Evaluations say that the program works best for young people who are ages 20 to 24, who are a little bit older than a typical Job Corps student. And I want to briefly mention a couple of the people who are profiled in the story briefly. One of them is this remarkable young woman named Shamira Mills. She's 28 years old now, and she really credits Job Corps with turning her life around. She had wanted to be a chef, tried to go to culinary school, didn't make it, and she went to Job Corps for HVAC training. She graduated, found a entry-level job with a small HVAC firm, and now she's at a larger HVAC firm. She's bought herself a car, she has her own apartment, and she really credits the training and the certification that she got from Job Corps for getting her there. Same with another young man who is a single dad. He managed to connect with a solar installation company and is earning the prevailing wage now, which is $62 an hour. And he really credits one of his counselors at Job Corps for connecting him with the company that offered him this apprenticeship program that allowed him to become a solar installer. So yes, success stories do happen. Perhaps the most famous one is professional boxer George Foreman. He went to Job Corps back in the 1970s as a high school dropout who was just headed in a wrong direction. And he was so grateful to the program that he actually paid the federal government back for what it cost to put him through Job Corps. The problem is that for every Shamira and for every Ricky Gass, that's the other young man who's a success, there are multiples more young people who may end up in exactly the same job that they had before they came, as the government audit found, or they end up unemployed, or they get kicked out for various reasons from the program. Given the limited resources we have, the question I really want to raise with this article was, can't we do better? We must be able to better.
You make an important point, of course, that no program, Job Corps or anything else, is going to solve generations of systemic poverty. But you do raise some of those points of what could be helping. And I'm wondering, who's listening to you? You were stonewalled by a lot of officials when you were doing this story. And has there been a lot of response? Have you heard from people who are now willing to take your call?
Well, the short answer is no. There is a lot of inertia around the Job Corps program for the reasons that I articulated. And to be perfectly frank, also, the population of disconnected young adults is not a politically powerful one. There is a reason that $1.7 billion is the bulk of the funding that we spend on out of work, out of school youth is a pittance compared to what we spend on many, many other priorities. There are a lot of misconceptions about who this population is. There's a lot of misunderstanding about why young people might be disconnected. And so there's not a lot of political momentum around this group, which I'm hoping will change as the pandemic puts more of a spotlight on the plight of young people. What is more likely to happen is that in an optimistic scenario, there are a lot more resources that flow into other alternatives that seem more promising than Job Corps, and Job Corps just kind of withers away on its own. I'm not terribly optimistic that we're going to have a wholesale reform of this program as it is, simply because there's not a lot to gain if you're a politician to go after Job Corps right now. There's a lot more to gain by adding more money into the system, into all other scenarios, and that's actually fine by me. And I think that's fine by a lot of the advocates who work in this area who just want to see more resources and who don't necessarily want to see Job Corps getting the lion's share of the money that's going to out of school youth.
Well, one thing that jumped out of me in your story, and you actually repeated it just earlier in this conversation, which is that every state has a Job Corps center, which to me means there's a story in every state for every education reporter.
Yes, I am certainly hoping that what could maybe create some more momentum for reform, even if not around the program, then around other ways to help out of school, out of work youth, is for more education reporters to take a look at what's happening at the local Job Corps Center. And even, apart from that, just looking at who are the disconnected young people in your community? What are the options that are available to them? Is there anything that's working? I think part of the problem here too is that policymakers are a little bit of a loss about the kinds of alternatives that might be more effective than Job Corps. And so over the years, the default has been Job Corps because it's been around, it's easy, it's a line item in the budget that's easy for Congress to renew. But they need communities to bring to them alternative models for things that might be working. And I think journalists can contribute a lot by uncovering what those models are, as well as shining a light on some of the challenges that might be happening in their own communities around disconnected youth.
As you described, there's a lot, unfortunately, of opaqueness around some of these contractors and how they operate. But shouldn't there be a lot of materials that reporters can get through open records and checking with their local municipalities and states?
The federal contractors for Job Corps, I think, are kind of in a unique situation. I did not go as far as filing requests with EOL because there was so much information available from the Inspector General's office and GAO audits. And then also a lot of the contracts are publicly available too. They're not that easy to find, but I did manage to find a trove of the contracts that were handed out to these guys just to get the dollar figures. The actual details of the contracts are apparently proprietary. There have been some protests filed by the contractors to protect that information. So that is not as available as you would think. But if I were in Congress and could wave a magic wand, that is one of the things that I would like to know. I would like to break open the black box of what's in these contracts and find out how much money are these guys making? What's the profit margin? Where is this money going? And are there better ways to administer these contracts so we get better outcomes?
You're the author of a book on disconnected youth, and I'm wondering, are there misconceptions about this particular group of young people that you would want education reporters to be careful about mistakenly amplifying?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I wrote the book for a couple of reasons. The takeaways I'd like people to get from the book are, and I think these are things that are not common knowledge. Young adulthood has really become a very important developmental phase in a lot of people's lives, but there has been this gigantic divergence in young people's trajectories. And I think it really is a pretty big driver of inequality and who succeeds and who doesn't. At the moment, I think there's a kind of a popular conception that it's all about poor choices rather than about the systems that are influencing what's happening with young adults. There's this kind of failure to launch stereotype about young people or, the person who's in their parents' basement. Most people who are disconnected are not those kids. Yes, there are a few, but we are largely talking about young adults who have been abandoned by various government systems that are intended to help them, but have cut them off before they are ready to take on the responsibilities of adulthood, and who do not have the lengthy parental support that middle class and upper middle class young adults have today. At the same time, the young adults themselves do not see themselves as victims. They really do see a lot of self-efficacy. They have a lot of sense of agency, but they are limited by the environment that they're in, and they're limited by their own youthfulness. So I think reporters who want to write about this population kind of have to keep in mind the larger context in which we're operating. There hasn't been a lot written about young adulthood. That's terribly nuanced, number one. And number two, there hasn't been a lot written from the perspective of young adults who see the systemic barriers around them, who want to succeed, don't consider themselves victims, and resent stereotypes about the circumstances they're being in, the result of, quote, choices on their part, when that's not what's happening at all.
Well, along those lines, a lot of what we've talked about, unfortunately, right now is discouraging for the outlook for young people in terms of the programs available to support them and the impact of the pandemic. But I'm wondering, is there something positive or some good news you'd like to see getting more attention right now?
About what's happening with young people as a result of the pandemic, unfortunately, no. The economic circumstances are dire. Hoping the recovery will take care of some of that, but it does not erase the underlying crisis that we had even before the pandemic began. Where I think there is good news is that there is still quite a bit of innovation around preventing disconnection. There's a lot more attention now being paid to options like apprenticeships or school of the career transitions. They're kind of adjacent to this problem of disconnection, but they're really, really important and maybe a way to eliminate this problem altogether. But what heartens me is that there are many more models, many more groups, many more educators who are interested in ensuring that smooth P through 16 transition for young adults. And that's what gives me hope for the future.
Ann Kim is a Washington Monthly contributing editor and the author of Abandoned, America's Lost Youth and the Crisis of Disconnection. And she is an EWA Reporting Fellow. And thank you for making time for EWA Radio.
Thank you so much, Emily. It's been a pleasure.
And that wraps up another episode for us. If there is a story or a reporter you want to learn more about, drop us a line with radio@ewa.org. The mission of the Education Writers Association is to strengthen the community of education journalists and improve the quality of education coverage. For more than 70 years, EWA has helped reporters get the story right. Have a great week, take care of yourselves, and thank you for listening.